speaker, Bob Headland, is well known to many of you, also on the committee. He's sharing the platform with Adrian, both ex-BAS, so I'm sure they're going to say something that we're all interested in, about mapping historically and currently in the way it's going to go into the future. So, Bob.
Well, many thanks, Phil and Colin, and ladies and gentlemen. I suppose, as a quick introduction, I was first on South Georgia with BAS a couple of years ago in 1977, and I disgraced myself in 1982 when I gave it away. My subjects subsequently have been, you can have a choice, geographical history or historical geography, hence this one. And with my co-presenter, you'll see we're talking about South Georgia mapping from the earliest days until the inland surveys of Duncan Coss, which is a very clean division between the two of us. One of us is the ancient and the other is the modern. I think we'll start on part one. One emphasis I want to make about South G, from the history and the geography, is its place among what I like to call, it might become more popular, the peri-Antarctic islands. You have these 19 little islands around the continent, mainly in the Southern Ocean or very close to the Southern Ocean, influenced by its oceanography and things of this nature. On the other side, there's the whole lot. I spent some time fiddling with the PowerPoint and getting colors. There they all are, 19 of them, to the same scale. These little outposts of the Antarctic are significant from many points of view, particularly this meeting. We're talking about biodiversity. They've all had periods, if you can look at their history. Well, if you consider the 1800s, it was sealing, massive over-exploitation, first of ferries and then of ellies. Then came the 1900s and similar massive exploitation of whale stocks, which with the reduction of seals may have been more than perhaps Captain Cook's days. Whaling stations, certainly South Georgia had the majority. South Orkney's a small one, South Shetland's considerably more. There were stations also on Kerguelen and Campbell Island, and even a semi-factory type sealing station on Macquarie. Now, back to subjects. The whole idea of South Georgia from a long time ago, you have some of the earliest records, potential Spanish and other sightings, and the idea in the southern end of South America, southern end of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this is one of these light-emitting diode screens, isn't it? So it's probably not worth my trying to point that out. The little light doesn't show so strongly. If I need to, I'll use the old method. But you can see the Gulf of San Sebastian, the Golfo de San Sebastian, and islands thought to be there. From the mapping of South Georgia, well, this slide is a 2 for the price of 1. There's some British Antarctic Territory stamps around it. And the 2 early circumnavigations of the Antarctic, the first and the second indeed, Captain Cook, who went south of the Antarctic Circle on 3 occasions, and Bellingshausen, who did it on 6. There they are, and the routes you can see going round, and the thing in common with them is 1775, Cook for South Georgia, and 1819, the same thing. Now, the historical bit is fairly straightforward. There's Cook and his book. He landed in 3 places, displayed the colours, and took possession for George III, and perhaps the beginning of British interest there. His book, published in 1776, had maps and all sorts of descriptions of the island and circumstances, and many other places, including particularly fur seals. If we look at his map, now, we'd say it was the right way up, but Cook would say it was upside down. South was at the top of his map, but there's his course I've outlined in red. You can see first sighting Willis Islands, named after a drunken midshipman of the name of Willis. Possession Bay, 17th of January 1775, 2 years after the Antarctic Circle. They were a little bit lost in mist. As you can see, there's a bit of navigation here, and it was very close to discovering Clark Rocks by running aground on them, by hitting them. They were named after the office of the watch. The description of the island, well, there it is. Were no less savage and terrible, wild rocks, lofty summits lost in the clouds, valleys covered everlasting snow. Not a tree was to be seen, nor a shrub big enough to make a toothpick. He was there at the maximum of the Little Ice Age. Indeed, for his circumnavigation of the Antarctic, it didn't prove all that brilliant. Lands doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrid and savage aspects I have not words to describe. That's sufficiently good, ladies and gentlemen. It's very quotable. Anyway, results. Back to subject. Mapping, 1776. There's Cook's published map of South G. You can see south is still oriented to the north. His course went round the island. Coming in from Willis Island, he's seen, you might see Union Point. I'm just getting it wrong. He came in from this side, saw it from that side, went round the island, thought he found the Antarctic, came to the bottom end, called it Cape Disappointment, and from there he could see Union Point. He unified his surveys and found it was not exactly Antarctica. Sealers soon became interested in South Georgia. The resources, Cook reported not only fur seal pelts, or fur seals, of course, and a potential sale for them in Canton. So rapidly, sealers were there, increasing numbers. There's not much literature, and you might remember a conference we had a few years ago about it, but there is one sealer's map. The provenance of this is a bit mixed. Alberto Faustini published it in 1906. There's the journal, there's the map in considerable detail. He attributed it to a sealer in 1802, but it has most of Cook's names and others. It's a bit skinny in the middle, but that, after Cook, the first of sealers' maps. Now, Bellingshausen, I mentioned, crossed the Antarctic Circle in 6 places, different places from those where Captain Cook crossed it. From Cook's point of view, it went far south in the places where he went far south, otherwise he'd have seen the continent. But here's Bellingshausen coming around South Georgia on the south side, which is quite an interesting comparison, getting the island very well mapped between them. Interestingly, he met sealers at the north end, the southern coast of the west end. Let's get myself right. With an upside down map, you can lose it quite easily. And a couple of those were renegade Russians, and one he didn't like very much. He talks about him in his narrative and calls him, it translates as the cockroach, and passed quite a bit of information about South Sandwich Islands, which is probably the result of Bellingshausen's northern part of the South Sandwiches discovery. Anyway, enough of that, and a little more in a moment. Disappointment. Cape Disappointment is the last place Cook saw, and there it is sketched by Pavel Mikhailov, the artist aboard Bellingshausen expedition, and there it is a modern version of it. So then we've got the island circumnavigated, position, coast features mentioned, and an amount of mountains. If you combine Cook and Bellingshausen, you have the maps from 1775 and 1819, and that's the beginning of quite a reasonable story for it. Sealers. Most of the interest in the island was firstly fur seals, and after they were vastly depleted, elephant seals. So we get more sealers maps, or more maps generally. These are 2 published in London by a magnificent Victorian society, Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. I very much like the idea. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist. So you can see South Georgia. Well, I don't need to do this. Well, I can't, can I? It's a bit far out. And we have an enlargement of it here, the South America chart. Another interesting one where it did appear on maps, it was slowly appearing on more and more, but of particular interest were Colton's Atlas, 1845 in New York. That covered much of the world in many places. And here we have South Georgia, Falklands, and even the South Orkneys specifically on it. And here's an enlargement of South G. His idea of that was so many of the sealers came from the New England states of the United States. The British sealers were gone mainly by the 1830s for some of the last. They were an early number, but the US kept going. Indeed, the last sealer on South Georgia was Benjamin Cleveland aboard Daisy with Robert Cushman Murphy aboard. But there's your sealing version. But this continued, and we can move on rather rapidly to 1881. Those of you who remember the Bass Club Bulletin, then the British Association, the formal publication, whose title I know very well, a very good translation of Klutschak's map was made. He was an Austrian traveller aboard sealers, giving an excellent account of what sealing was like and produced that map, and greatly lamenting the decline of the sealers. There's interesting things you can see about it too. If you look just up there, you have Rattenhaven, Rat Harbour. So we have at least a date before which way rats were introduced. First wintering and first major scientific expedition of that period was Wilhelm Filchner. Losing it, aren't I? Mottaf, the German International Polar Year expedition based in Royal Bay. There's their station, which had a cupola for the observation of the transit of Venus. They were there as part of the first International Polar Year. The mapping and survey they did, as you can see, at Moltkehaven, their bay was in considerable detail. Indeed, in the vicinity of Royal Bay, going to St. Andrews Bay, around Cape Varkop and further south, with the mountains, they had very good local maps. They didn't extend much beyond the region where they were working. There were no general surveys of the island. But Royal Bay was very well done very early. The publication came in 1891. Not much to say then, but remember I was talking about the end of sealing, 1800s, and the whaling in the 1900s. Now with biodiversity, it's the fish and their relatives that are being exploited. But Carl Anton Larsen and Norway, the whalers, he was with 2 private expeditions, a Nordenskiöld's expedition, and established Grytviken whaling station. There's a chart. You can see Carl Anton Larsen, South Georgia, and the date I've expanded there. It's an original pencil, quite light pencil, on a rather darkened background. That's a lousy slide to present to you. But ladies and gentlemen, there's the actual map. So you might like to look at that subsequently. Larsen and whaling, of course, harbours and anchorages were a main feature. There's Cumberland Bay from Larsen's map. I have rather enhanced that one. Again, it's just over there. The first Admiralty chart. When Larsen arrived, there was the question of sovereignty, UK, Argentina, and so forth, and a dispute over the place. So the vessel Sappho came down, Michael Hodges commanding it, and he and Larsen produced the first of the Admiralty charts. There it is, 1909. Going backwards very quickly, by the way, in London, things becoming interesting. Claiming of South Georgia, that you can say the basis of claim and dependencies was there, but 1908, there was the formal proclamation, amended in 1917, 1982, and the last one, 1985, when South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands became apparent. You've got the various divisions of the territory there, but with time against me and a long story, just bear in mind official interest could be 1908. The first stipendiary magistrate, James Innes Wilson, 1912, took up his post in Grytviken, later moved to King Edward Point, still I think we can say the seat of government, can't we? And the question of movement of whales, this is a paper published in the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society with mapping and specifics and descriptions of the island by the magistrate that was based on the previous survey you saw with steady improvement in names and details. Now, earlier when I was talking about the IPY German expedition, I said Filchner, I got it wrong. Wilhelm Filchner's expedition aboard Deutschland on her way south, visited South Georgia, and after getting stuck in the ice and doing a drift comparable to Endurance and Shackleton, but she was much further to the east, so she wasn't crushed and got back to South Georgia. They were there a second time. On the second time, they produced this map in considerable detail. Just an aside here, ladies and gentlemen, on the way south, this was published in 1912, on the way south, they made a blueprint printed in the drawing office in Grytviken whaling station. There's a copy of it now that is in the archives of Scott Polar. I was able to collect that one whilst visiting the remains of the villa. And that's all you have. Shackleton's contribution in his expeditions to the mapping of South Georgia wasn't much. The original Filchner one, you see there's no relief, it's almost 3,000 meter high islands. And if you look at Konghofen Bay with Shackleton attempting to get to Stromness Bay, it looks a lot shorter on that map. And it was a fragment of a copy of that map that he had on crossing the island. Whalers. Sigurd Risting, writing a considerable history of the whaling. I done a wrong button. Sigurd Risting, with a history of whaling, produced this map, 1922. It's an awfully light touch, isn't it? Next lecturer, be careful. Got it. 1922, It's not me. 1922 produced this showing the whaling stations of what was happening with the development of 9 different whaling sites. Now I'll say next, please, and see what it does. The time after the First World War was a long committee and that published in 1920 its report on research and development in the Falkland Islands and dependencies. And that emphasized the importance of survey, the whaling industry, understanding the island, and what future there might be. The discovery expeditions lasted from 1925, and the last publication was 51. But the major thing is John Chaplin, there's one of his reports, number 3, did a very detailed survey of the harbors and anchorages. Here, the Bass Library and the Sprine Library has it, is the volume of the discovery expedition reports, 25 to 51. There's its logo. That's phenomenal. He had a small vessel, the Alert. There was 2 illustrations of her from the book. One of the things published was the first Antarctic pilot, there it is, and the first reasonable charts of the island. There's one of them, and you can see on the caption, depth in fathoms. There was Chaplin himself assisted by a midshipman, and the first of the modern Admiralty charts of South G is one of those over there. As well as the island in general and the approaches to South Georgia, he also covered a large numbers of harbors and anchorages, and some of these charts are still current. It's interesting when you look at positions of glaciers and other phenomena of them. But here's a few of them. That's, I think, 3 out of about 15. I haven't brought all of those, but it was a series of charts that effectively remain current, ancient and modern, and current Admiralty charts still have the main ones, the principal anchorages. And you saw the size of Alert. You could get into most of them. That does a large amount of the maritime side, harbors and anchorages. The interior, this is a chart by a German expedition, the Kohl-Larsen expedition. Ludwig Kohl, the Filkner's expedition, remained behind after Deutschland left, had an appendicitis, had his appendix out, but couldn't take the voyage beyond that, and married the manager's daughter. That was Margit Larsen, of C.A. Larsen, whose map's over there. So they became Margit Kohl-Larsen, and Margit and Ludwig were involved in a mountaineering survey, scrambling and climbing of South Georgia, with a photographer. There's the film, you might remember in one of the early South Georgia meetings, I showed you Antarctic. And there's the beginning of the inland surveys. Now combine that lot, you have all the exterior bits, the bays and anchorages, with the discovery expeditions. You have the beginning of the knowledge of the interior from the Kohl-Larsen expedition. The first Falkland Islands dependencies South Georgia map, there it is, published in 1950. This gives the Admiralty charts from the discovery expeditions and the interior from the Kohl-Larsen expedition. You can see here there's various degrees of reliability, and the subsequent history of the maps in that part of the world are a steady increase in reliability. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So, I'm Adrian Fox, and I was formerly the head of the Mapping and Geographic Information Centre here at Bass, and I've been closely involved with many of the maps later on in my talk. So, here we go. So, Bob's given a good explanation of the way that by 1950 or so, there was a pretty good understanding of the coastline and kind of maritime area of South Georgia, but there were still gaps in the knowledge of the interior. And that's where the South Georgia Survey, 1951 to 1957, comes in. And this was a series of expeditions that attempted to make the first comprehensive survey and mapping of the interior. And those surveys were led by Duncan Carse. He was a very interesting man. He'd been part of the discovery investigations in 1933, and he was in BGLE, British Graham Land Expedition, to the Antarctic Peninsula in the mid-30s. After the Second World War, he had a very varied career. He'd been in the Navy during the war,
And then he's quite well known for being the voice of the radio program, Dick Barton, Special Agent. And he's quite well known in the kind of 50s and actually appeared as a guest on Desert Island Discs with Roy Plumley in January 1953. So that's actually on the BBC Sounds archive, if anybody's interested in digging that out. He never lost his passion for polar exploration, though. And after World War II in 1950, he began planning what he described as a small, inexpensive, and useful expedition to South Georgia. That was based on taking advice from the RGS and SPRI, where some useful work could be done. And he had an incredible amount of energy, and he was a good organizer. And so he put together a privately funded series of expeditions to comprehensively survey and map the interior of the island. So his vision really was to bring together developments in alpine mountaineering and that kind of equipment, and developments in survey, and put together a team of surveyors, geologists and mountaineers who could travel kind of fast and light over the island. And it actually turned out to be a really efficient, effective way of working, and they achieved an incredible amount. So penetrating deep into the interior in a series of overland traverses, as you can see from that map extract from Alec Trendle's book. Many of you will be familiar with that, but if you're not, and you're interested in Duncan Carr's surveys, then I'd recommend having a read of that. It's a fascinating book. And so the idea was to travel overland into the interior, doing systematic geodetic survey and detail survey as sketches as they went, and then pull it all together to make a map at the end. So I think that gives you the kind of idea of what they were trying to do and the way that they were working. So there are actually 4 expeditions during the 1950s. The 1955 to 1956 was the biggest one, where they were on the island for 6 months, and that had a team of 8. The other ones had a smaller team, some 4 and some 6. And they were a mix of surveyors, geologists and climbers. So again, I think that gives you some idea of the kind of conditions that they were working in. So the idea was to travel fast and light, but they still had to lug this heavy Tavistock theodolite. That was the kind of instrument that was being used by the Ordnance Survey at the time, and a big heavy survey tripod. And you can see Chief Surveyor Tony Bumford, who was a captain in the Royal Engineers. And he was the chief engineer, the chief surveyor on the surveys. Later on became Director of National Mapping in Australia. And despite the conditions that they were working in, quite harsh in the interior of South Georgia, they had a very, very rigorous approach, and they were very strongly focused on detail and accuracy. And I think you can get some sense from that, from the beautiful detailed sketches that they did as they went along. They kind of stand alone as works of art. In fact, I have a frame, one of those at home in my office. So the end result was 200,000 scale map, published in 1958 by the Directorate of Overseas Surveys as DOS 610. 500-foot contours and lots and lots of summit heights on the map for the first time, so a real step forward. And it's an absolutely outstanding achievement for the time and the methods that they used. And really was a step change in the quality of the mapping, especially for the interior. And this is why we split the talk where we did, because this is really the beginning of the modern era. Tony Bumford was awarded the RGS Ness Award, 1958, for his work as the chief surveyor on the expeditions, and also for being the driving force for the production of the map. So it was very useful as a map, but also it became the basis of quite a few other kind of derived products. So on the left, you've got an extract from the Royal Marines South Georgia Training Manual, for example, or on the right, you've got Chalmers Clapperton's 50,000 scale geomorphology map. published by Bass in the early 1970s, again, which sits on the map as its base layer. And then used by the Combined Services Expedition to South Georgia, 1964 to 65. I think we've got John Chester in the audience, maybe. I think he's meant to be here. So that's very kindly, I got access to John Chester's map that he actually had on the expedition in the 1960s and was used on the first ascent of Mount Paget, December 30, 1964. If you haven't seen the article about that in the latest newsletter, then I'd recommend reading that. So I can't emphasize enough really that it was a terrific product for its day, but by the 1990s, problems with it were becoming apparent. So it's actually a really difficult thing to start mapping an area like South Georgia from scratch before the era of satellite imagery and GPS and so on, because it's hundreds of nautical miles away from the nearest other land. So actually positioning it in the correct place in space and starting to grow a map outwards is a really difficult thing. So the cast map's based on 7 astronomical fixes taken with a theodolite, 18 sun azimuths, and critically 8 baselines, and then expanded out to 88 trig stations. So it's effectively 8 separate surveys all stuck together at the end. So not surprisingly, there are some systematic distortions and warping in the overall map because it's 8 separate maps stuck together. Obviously, the glacier fronts and ice cover are extremely inaccurate now, and actually there are a few copies left after 50 years of usage, and particularly the Falklands conflict. But Bass Archive does have a scan that can be printed to make more copies. There's this apocryphal story, which I'm sure many people know about at the beginning of the Falklands conflict, or when it became clear something was going to happen. Someone from the Foreign Office was sent down to Stanford's map shop to buy up all the maps they could of the Falklands and South Georgia. And when they got there, the shop assistant said, "Is something happening down there? Some South American people were in here last week and bought them all." I don't know whether that's true or not, but it makes a nice story. So this is the latest coastline based on satellite imagery in red, overlaid on the cast map. So at first glance, it's a really, really good fit. But actually, if you look closely, there are some significantly wrong. And no matter what you do to it, you can't make it fit because it is based on 8 separate surveys, so there is some warping in it. So that gives you an understanding of, the difficulties that they had making a map completely from scratch in the middle of nowhere with 1950s technology. So that kind of led on really, that realization that there were issues with the other map and there'd not be any copies left and so on, that led on to the requirement to have a new map made. And so Bass was given a contract by the government of South Georgia in 2004 to make a new map based on satellite imagery, but crucially not with any new survey. And the idea was to produce something at the same scale as the DOS 610 map, 200,000 scale, and base it on a mosaic of Landsat satellite images. So to give you some idea about South Georgia, we went through the entire archive of Landsat images back to the early 1980s, and we still couldn't find a cloud-free image of the Willis Islands. So the Willis Islands is kind of, patched on from what else we could find. And the big advance was producing contours at 100 meters interval from the NASA Space Shuttle Radar Terrain Mapping Mission. So if you remember the space shuttle that used to go up there in the 80s and 90s, then before the catastrophic explosion, one of the missions had a radar instrument on it that was able to map most of the world down to about 56 south. So South Georgia was right on the limit of the orbit which means that the data is quite gappy in South Georgia, especially with it being very, very mountainous. There are areas that were hidden from the radar instrument by the terrain. But it was a step forward, really, in quality of elevation information for the interior, and allowed making the first kind of complete data set of the elevation information contours of the interior of the island. So the spatial accuracy is about 50 meters, because it's based on Landsat imagery with a 30-meter pixel size. And the elevation information from the SRTM is about 7 to 25 meters, depending on where you are. So a step forward, and pretty good for a 200,000 scale map. So detail was interpreted on from the Landsat satellite imagery, coastline, rock outcrop, glacier extents, comprehensively updated, and so on. And then not included in the map, but useful to do, was a vegetation layer that was extracted by remote sensing methods from the different wavelength bands in the Landsat imagery. And it was printed as double-sided with the satellite image map on the back. So once it had been used for a while, the feedback from the users in the field was that the contours tended to smooth the terrain because the SRTM product had a 90-meter sample size, so effectively a football pitch sample size, where the height was averaged over that football pitch. It tended to smooth the terrain and also knock the tops off the mountains, as you can imagine. But so that became clear that that map did have its limitations because of that. So again, once you've got something like that, it tends to generate other spin-off products. So one of those, for example, was the wildlife low-flying avoidance zones map and helicopter flight manual, which was a ring-bound encapsulated manual with lots and lots of A4 extracts of the map that the pilot could have on his lap or strapped to his leg when he was flying, and flip it over as they got to the appropriate place. That was quite a nice thing. Won a prize from the British Cartographic Society, which was nice endorsement. And then this provided the beginnings of the modern South Georgia GIS. There had been an attempt at pulling together environmental information for South Georgia into a GIS before, in a project led by Phil Trathen, which culminated in an atlas of environmental information for South Georgia in the early 90s. But this was an attempt at producing something that could be delivered over the web, based on the 2004 mapping as the base layer, and then stacking up lots of other management and environmental information on the top. So you can see that's an early incarnation, and it's been continuously updated ever since, and still running now in 2025. So the thing about South Georgia GIS and GIS in general, it's a very powerful tool for comparing different layers of information and looking at the relationships between them. So for example, it becomes very clear that rats and pipits can't coexist in the same place, basically because the rats eat the pipits' eggs. And that's shown very strongly by overlaying the two data sets in the GIS. That was one of the pieces of information that led towards the wildlife restoration and rat eradication project on South Georgia. So that's been talking about overview mapping at 200,000 scale. By the 2010s, then there were quite strong drivers to start producing some reliable larger scale maps of key areas on the island. So drivers for that included the habitat restoration project. So you need decent maps to do the reindeer roundup, and also to plan the helicopter baiting for the rat eradication. If you don't have a good understanding of the terrain and you miss a side valley with rats in it, then clearly within a few years you're going to be back where you started. So it was important to have good information upon which to plan the helicopter flight paths and so on for the basin. And with more and more visitors going there, you need good maps for management plans and to promote safe overland travel. So BAS started to be commissioned by the government of South Georgia to produce large-scale maps, 25,000 scale maps of a standard that could be comparable to Britain or Europe for key areas. So at the moment, there are 4 maps, plus some included on the Shackleton Crossing map, which I'll talk about later on. But it's actually quite a difficult thing to do in remote mountainous place like South Georgia. So 750 nautical miles from the nearest airstrip. So no possibility of any systematic aerial photography like you would base a map on in anywhere else. Very limited aerial photography coverage existing from HMS Endurance helicopters. That had always been commissioned by the Hydrographic Office, so only really followed the coastline and didn't venture into the interior. Had no more geodetic survey network since the 1950s, CARS surveys. So the first attempt, Thatcher Peninsula, was based on that existing information and doing the best available job. But actually the solution is to use sub-meter resolution stereo satellite imagery, which became available for South Georgia from about 2012 with a sensor called Worldview 2. So this is the Thatcher Peninsula map, which was applying modern photogrammetry techniques to the existing aerial photography and survey, and basically doing the best you could with what was available at the time, with a satellite image as an image on the reverse, but the contours and the detail all based on the aerial photography. And we're able to achieve something of comparable accuracy and style to European or British maps based on the existing information. But actually the way forward is to use this kind of worldview stereo sub-meter resolution satellite imagery. So that's the kind of stuff that you're familiar with seeing on the news. You know, when you see something that's happened in Iran or whatever, then that's the kind of imagery that they're going to show you on the news. So that scene was taken over Stromness in April 2012, and we were able to use that kind of imagery to produce a 25,000 scale map of the Busan region with Cumberland Bay and the whaling stations and so on. So the extract gives you some idea of the detail, and it's the equivalent to flying mapping standard aerial photography from about 10,000 feet. And then that was supplemented with GPS surveyed ground control points. So 19 of them for the Busan region map and another 11 for Bath Peninsula and Hound Bay. So you can see the advances in equipment. I was much happier that I was carrying that equipment in that photo than the Tavistock theodolite and the big tripod that Carter's lot had back in the 1950s. So having got that survey information, we did an experiment by seeing what could be achieved just using the kind of metadata that came with the satellite imagery based on the orbit. And that showed that actually just the information that came with the satellite imagery would allow you to position the images to within about 2 to 5 meters. Now that 5 meters is only 0.2 millimeters on a 1 to 25,000 scale map, and it's actually better than the accuracy you can get if you're walking over land with a Garmin handheld GPS. So we actually concluded that we could produce a good enough series of maps, but very efficiently without the need for ground control by just working with the satellite imagery. And so that's the way you would work from now on. So 4 maps completed: Thatcher Peninsula, Busan region, Bath Peninsula in the bottom right-hand corner, and then there's also a Hound Bay sheet which goes off the bottom of the Bath Peninsula one. So again, some nice awards from the British Cartographic Society, which shows you're on the right track. some detail. And then again, once you've got that kind of level of mapping, it tends to spawn spin-off projects. So we were able to use that mapping for a series of management plan maps for the South Georgia government. So that one's for the Shackleton Walk from Fortuna over to Stromness Harbour. I think many people in this room will have done that walk, so probably use that map. And then jumping forward to 2018, by that time there was better satellite height information available for the interior from a satellite called ASTA, which generated three-dimensional information. So we're able to update the contours and produce a new map based on that in 2018. And again, continuously updated the South Georgia GIS with many more data layers, downloadable data. It's a great resource for anyone who's interested in South Georgia. And then on the back of that 2018 map, there's a map of the Shackleton Traverse. The idea was to produce some good quality mapping for that journey to make it safer for people doing that journey and to try to kind of give people a better chance of success, because the statistics for people failing on it were quite high. So we thought that making a new map might help with that. And again, this is based on sub-meter resolution stereo satellite imagery. And then it's got 25,000 scale details of the start, the Razorback Ridge crossing and the Breakwing Gap crossing. I don't know about you, but whenever I go for a walk somewhere, often finding the route out of the car park at the start's the hardest part. So we thought having a decent map of the start might actually help people. So, and then where are we going to go in the future, just to finish? So as I said, the way you would work now for topographic mapping is to map directly from high-res satellite imagery. But there's also a product produced by the US Polar Geospatial Center, which they originally did for Antarctica, but in its latest iteration also includes South Georgia. And this is based on using a supercomputer to crunch together thousands and thousands of the sub-meter stereo satellite images to generate a three-dimensional data set at 2-meter resolution. So what you're seeing on the screen isn't a satellite image, it's a surface elevation model based on the satellite imagery. So if I add the contours to it, then you can get some idea about the quality of the information. Sorry, the quality of the information that's now freely available. And again, that moves on the mapping of South Georgia another step by having all of this high quality 2-meter, highly accurate data available for free download. And then that's a sample of the kind of imagery that's based on. We're now onto WorldView 3 with 30 centimeter resolution in black and white and 1.24 meters resolution in color. Gives you some idea of the detail. You can see some of the old whaling era buildings at Ocean Harbour. There's some kind of man-made drainage ditch system up on the left-hand side. And you can just about pick out individual seals to do a seal count or something like that, for example. So that's where we are now. And that last slide kind of gives you a summary of where we've come in 280 years of mapping. So I hope you'll all agree that some progress has been made over that period. And Bob and I would be very happy to take any questions.
Great. Well, we've certainly got time for a few. When did place names begin to stabilize? Because I noticed on one of the sealers charts was Royal Bay on the south of South Georgia as well as on the north of South Georgia. And that must have been confusing.
There's a couple of alert codes named after the same boat too. APC was 1947, I believe. Antarctic Place Names Committee. And a lot of work subsequently. And quite a few things to resolve.
That being one of the reasons for the establishment of the Place Names Committee, to sort out those sorts of tangles and produce one definitive data set for South Georgia. There's a really interesting book written by Geoffrey Hattersley Smith, which is published as one of the Bath Scientific Report Station series, which gives all the background to all of the place names on South Georgia up to the 1980s.
That's not the book, that's the Bible.
That's really worth getting hold of and having a read. Or if you go onto the Place Names Committee website, the information about the background of the names is all stuck to the names in that website as well. So.
Are there maps with which record the glacial retreat in any systematic way?
This is a microphone.
Okay. Sorry. The question is, are the maps that BAS or others have produced which record glacial retreat systematically? There are 6 of us here who spent 4 months between 1981 and 1982 with the latest piece of kit at that time, which was a laser rangefinder, doing a trip that was very similar to the Trendle southern route that you showed the map of, trying to record the moraines and glacial retreat at that stage. And be very interesting to know what the latest material is.
So if you go onto the South Georgia GIS, then there is a glacier front change layer that you can display on the South Georgia GIS. And that's actually maintained by Laura, who's in the back row. So that's continuously maintained from as new satellite imagery becomes available and is available. You can just view it as a layer. There's also the Alton Cook paper from 2010, which I showed the GIS analysis about the pipits and the rats. So that paper has a comprehensive discussion of changes in the glacier fronts up to 2010. And then there's a previous paper that's referenced in that one by a Scottish geologist whose name escapes me at the moment.
John Gordon, who
was
with our team.
Okay, so
part of that expedition.
He did so the Alton Cook paper updates the great work that John Gordon and your team did. So there is a time series, but if you go on the South Georgia website, the most available information and the way that things have changed with lots and lots of samples is available to bring up.
Well, thank you very much. It's very helpful. Certainly,
Probably time for
coffee time conversation.
probably time for one more question.
Who would like the microphone bouncing to them?
Otherwise, let's move on to the next talk, which is about the archives. Ian Hopkins has kindly agreed